start with that. You ready to go? Perfect. Okay. Brilliant. Well, thank you all for joining us for the industrial panel session. I think this is going to be one of the highlights of the meeting. We're really lucky to have to get a different perspective, and we're really grateful to all our industrial sponsors for the support that they've given us, but also for the fact that they're prepared to take part in the conference itself. It really means a lot to us, and we'll get hopefully a very interesting set of perspectives. The panel is going to run as we're going to have some opening statements. We'll then have some questions that we've sort of thought about beforehand, but then towards the end, we really like to have questions from you. So please do be thinking about questions you might like to ask people as we go through. So I'm John Aston. I'm a statistician based here in the maths department in Cambridge, and I'm one of the co-directors for the Centre for Maths of Information in Healthcare. And we're really fortunate with our panel today. So from Iphoria, we have Sharon Rushd. Iphoria is one of the sort of leading purveyors of AI for real clinical and preclinical labs, really getting the AI to the people who are going to use it in ways that they can take advantage of some of the most cutting edge deep learning and cloud-based technologies, yet do it in a simple and intuitive way. So we're really interested in getting her perspectives on how we can use AI within image-based, particularly within the labs and clinics. From MathWorks, we've got Martina Sciola. MathWorks is very close to my heart in the sense that I did my PhD in MATLAB. Really, all my image processing that I did for brain imaging was done using the tools that they produced, and from then onwards, they've been pivotal in really bringing image analysis software to those of us who are doing research in these areas. So really pleased that Martina can join us from that. From Microsoft, we've got Stephanie Hyland. I mean, Microsoft in some sense needs no introduction on a global scale, but we are very grateful for the partnership that we've had at CMIH with Microsoft Research on using some of the tools that they're generating for medical imaging, and how we can bring the research areas that we've been doing here in Cambridge with some of the work that they've been doing on some of their visualization techniques. So really grateful, Stephanie, for joining us. And we are hoping, although we have not yet got him, that we're going to be joined shortly by Johnny Hancock from Nvidia, which, as we all know, pioneered some of the use of graphics card-based machine learning techniques. So, but we've asked everybody to prepare a sort of opening statement. So for the next sort of 3 to 4 minutes, I'm going to ask everybody about what they think are the biggest implications for AI for medical imaging and healthcare. So, Sharon, what do you think are the biggest implications?
Thank you. Obviously, we come from a predominantly clinical background. So I would say for me, one of the biggest implications is getting the NHS on board. We need the clinicians to use the algorithms to shorten waiting lists and to get patients treated quicker and sorted. But we also need those clinicians within the NHS to feel confident that they are being supported by the NHS, so that they feel confident that they can use these tools, and there's not going to be any comeback at a later date saying, oh, we use this newfangled idea and we're not confident in the diagnosis that you've made. Having said that, the number of pathologists that are using these sort of platforms and that are using digital pathology is growing, but slowly. The adoption has been really slow, I feel, within the NHS for digital pathology. It's been a lot quicker within research, but nowhere near the same within the NHS. And the pathologists in general are an aging population. So we need to turn on some of you guys to the idea that medicine and maybe using digital pathology is better than maybe being a GP. We need some medics to adopt the idea as well that medicine is moving forward and that these diagnostic tools can actually work. I think as far as Iphoria is concerned, one of our biggest challenges in the creating of things like our CE, IVD regulated algorithms is actually getting the data. We obviously need images to be able to work on, to provide these algorithms. We don't have a clinical basis. We have the pathologists in-house, we have all the scientists and the computer bots in-house, but we don't have the access to the data. And obviously creating an algorithm takes an awful lot of images to train the algorithm, then to validate the algorithm, and then just for further validation throughout the process. Not something you can do with just 50 slides. It needs a lot of data. So we do need that support as well from the research side of things, as well as from the NHS that have obviously got all this data. We don't want patient information. We just want to know what the annotations need to be, where it needs to be, what it needs to look like. And we need to know what the pathologists want to see. It's all very well us saying, here's an algorithm that gives you an answer or a particular grading for a certain kind of stain. But if that's not what the pathologist wants to see, then that's useless. So yeah, I think that's mainly what we're up against. But I think on a research side, everybody seems quite happy to encompass new technologies, new ideas, and I say new, AI's been around for a while, but obviously more people need to be using it for it to be considered. I think that's it really.
Brilliant. Thank you. Moving across, I'll go across. So Stephanie, what do you think are the biggest implications of AI for medical imaging and healthcare?
Cool. Well, Mike is interesting. I think of it in two different sort of categories. One of them is the sort of practical implications and the likely benefits that AI could give to healthcare and in medical imaging, which I'll talk about in a second. And then also the mindset shift that I think it is triggering or will need to trigger. So on the practical benefits, I think probably going to have a bit of overlap across our opening statements here. Yeah, colluded before the panel. You know, I think obviously I'm a researcher in this space, so I believe it's going to be massively beneficial in multiple ways, both in terms of helping with efficiency and workflow. Like, you know, we know constantly hospitals are under strain, especially in imaging. You know, imaging demands and workflows are just getting more complex, and the volume is increasing. The number of radiologists is not increasing to keep up. So in terms of like improving efficiencies, supporting healthcare workers to do their jobs more efficiently, more safely, more reliably, as well as perhaps, you know, pushing our diagnostic capabilities further, you know, making our diagnoses, yeah, more possibly consistent across patients, but then also thinking about improving with rare diseases. Obviously, the promise of AI is that we have large data sets and we can potentially pick up on these more obscure cases, which could support doctors who maybe have only ever seen one case in their entire life, whereas if there was an AI assisting them, it could have seen, you know, thousands. So I think there's the, you know, workflow implications, the efficiency implications, but then also improving the quality of the standard of care as well, which obviously is combined with workflow implications. So there's the practical benefits that I'm seeing, but I think one of the other implications that AI will have in the health industry and in medical imaging as well is necessitating a mindset shift. So, you know, data is extremely important, as Sharon mentioned, and you know, the way data is collected in hospitals right now, it is not with AI in mind. You know, a lot of data is collected for operational reasons, for legal reasons, for internal work practices. But the idea that these hospitals are collecting a large amount of data on their own patients, which they could be using to develop their own models, for example, I think as AI becomes more prevalent, as people become more fluent in using it, hospitals will start to realize that they have this, you know, potential resource available to them, and they should be thinking about how they can actually collect it, perhaps in a way that enables them to use it for those downstream purposes. But then also not just on the data front, but then what do you do with that data? How do you integrate the systems that you've built with that data into your hospital? So there's this idea of like a learning hospital or a digitally enabled hospital. And like, you know, hospitals are aware of tech, they use tech, there is a lot of tech involved, but I think the promise of AI may force a bit of a mindset update that it's important to rapidly become fluent in these technologies, and also to think about, you know, doctors should understand at least some of what these systems can do so that they're enabled to create them themselves or, you know, best make use of them. So yeah, I think practical implications, but also in terms of shifting the culture of healthcare, I think AI might be a really great sort of lever that pushes that forward.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Martin.
Yep, so I totally agree with you both. And I think as a software company, I think the implication and impact for us would be to make tools easy to use. So not everyone is a computer scientist, right? We deal with clinicians, we have engineers, we have biologists. So it's important that everyone understands the language. And sometimes that doesn't happen. So I'm thinking about for the, having doctors that can trust the tools and the models, being able to explain what the model is doing. So making sure the explainability of what we create, the research that we do, is clear to everyone. In that way, we might have that, like you say, that's changing the the mindset of people and being more welcoming to AI rather than, oh, I'm scared, I don't know what it's doing. And then another aspect, I think it's also in terms of once you develop your algorithm, your model, then you need to have a process to validate and certify, because otherwise NHS or any other health sort of system worldwide will not accept it. So there are aspects related to actually the research itself, being able to explain to someone that is not expert on AI about what the model is doing, but also making sure that you have all the certification validation processes that are compliant. And we need regulations for that, because otherwise that's the way it works in the real world. So I think those are the most important things for to bring forward in order to have more AI in the digital health.
Brilliant, thank you. Do we have 20? Not yet. Okay. So I mean, I think we've seen there's a lot of commonality between what you said, and I think hopefully some of the questions that we'll talk about now will dig a bit further into some of the things that you've already talked about. But I think you've all talked about the fact that we need to make sure that end users are able to use the systems that people in this room, you as companies, create. What do you think are the sort of biggest challenges that end users, particularly sort of clinicians, radiologists, pathologists, face to accept machine learning systems in their clinical or preclinical practice?
I think something that I've come across a lot dealing with the NHS is that clinicians haven't been trained using these systems, so they aren't aware of them. Digital pathology is still fairly new to them, so having a screen rather than a microscope is still very new for pathologists. Obviously, I come from a pathology background, so radiology isn't the sort of imaging that I've ever dealt with, but on a pathology imaging side of things. So one thing that Iphoria have done, we make our platform available as an education hub. So universities and schools of medicine can use the platform to train medical students, biomedical students, dentistry students, veterinary students. So they see the image on a screen from day one. We don't want to completely get rid of microscopes. They have their uses, but when it comes to an educational tool, it's not the best. It also means remote learning is more possible. You can set exams on a remote platform, which is great. And it just means it's more accessible to everybody. And it can be viewed on anything from these newfangled fancy 4K screens that some clinicians will say you have to have, to even an iPad. So you can still make annotations on an iPad, which is great. And it just means it puts it in a way that students are used to these days. We don't all have a microscope at home, but I'm sure we've all got a laptop of some sort. So it just makes it all so much easier.
So speaking maybe more from the research end of things, I read a lot of papers where people create really beautiful algorithm solutions to problems, and the number of these which get translated into reality is a very small number. And I think one of the challenges here in the sort of translational gap, and I think this also touches on the barriers for these clinicians to use these systems, is that some of these solutions are being created completely independently of the end users. So you have clinicians who are essentially being told, we've created this thing for you, go ahead and use it. And I think this is problematic for two reasons. The first reason is that it's a sort of a social thing of who are you telling me what I need? So naturally, people might be a bit resistant. And I think especially with AI, there can be a risk of seeming like these computer scientists have flown in and solved the problem for you, and you just have to accept it. And I don't think anybody likes to be treated in that way, including clinicians and other healthcare workers. But the other practical issue is that it means that you're possibly not even solving the problem that matters to them. So you think you know what the problem is, you come up with a solution, but that might not actually be the issue in their work. And I think that's why it's really, really important to involve them in the design process for the solutions, to understand what are the challenges that they're facing, so that when you actually try and solve it, if you succeed, there is a chance they would ever use it, but also so that they can be involved in the process and they can feel a level of ownership over whatever comes out at the end. Yeah, so I think it's a little bit of a, and like I've heard from clinicians who say things like, the people who purchase the software in the hospital are not the people who use it. So there's a disconnect between the sort of product as sold and the end user. And yeah, they're never going to want to use something if it's not actually designed for them.
And let's be honest, some doctors might also think that those models will sort of take their jobs. So they are a little bit skeptical because they think there's going to be something against them. But actually, I think it's there to help, not to sort of destroy their job. I think we still need, we are at the stage where we still need the human. The last call has to be the human one. So yeah, that's a perception gap that we see in the society, I think, still.
Yeah, we have a UK-wide shortage of pathologists. So I think a lot of what we're doing as far as the algorithms for clinical diagnosis is not particularly to try and replace the pathologist, but to do those monotonous jobs, the ones that take up all the time all day, and maybe free up their time by using an algorithm so that they can then concentrate on the more complicated cases or the more interesting cases, rather than just doing the same thing every day, looking down a microscope, counting blobs. Yeah. If we've got an AI that can do that for them and give them a diagnosis in minutes as opposed to an hour, then that's what we need to do. We're not trying to replace pathologists, we're just trying to give them more time to do the bits they want to do.
Yeah, and another, I think, from the end user point of view, I think the research is doing great in this area, but I think we still have, with the data that we have available, we are still not using it all. So there are still validation issues that we need to consider before actually having a model that is, perfect. And I don't know what perfect means at the moment, but having so many, like we normally tend to use data that are, for example, from NHS in the UK, or in France, they might use data that are just in France. But then if you use those models across different countries, you might not get the same results because the demography is different. You have different ways how people collect the data. So it's important to have a variety, like large variety of data, to be able to have an algorithm that works worldwide. And that's also a challenge for the end users because they don't trust yet.
So that maybe leads me on to my next question, which was going to be, how do you think we conquer the data silo problem? The fact that we have all these different bits of data, all of which are very useful. We need to have them all together in order to actually really learn from it. Sometimes we can get away with just having the images, but sometimes we really do want to bring the other clinical factors in together. But we also want to do that in a way that preserves privacy and that people feel comfortable about using it, and that doctors feel that their patients are protected, and that patients themselves accept the fact that their data is being sent to do something. How do you think we best address that, both from a technical point of view, what kind of things can we be thinking about technically, but also from a point of view as part of the greater society that we want to think of, the ethical and legal rules around that? So I mean, Stephanie, do you want to?
Yeah, this is a tough question. I can start with the technical idea. So as has been mentioned already at this conference, I think there are technical approaches to privacy, which are somewhat in the research stage, but there are like real world deployments. So for example, using federated learning with differential privacy. So this idea that you could have a whole bunch of different hospitals, let's say, or health centers, which all have their own data, and they want to maintain ownership of their own data. But you still want to train a model on all of this data. What you can do is you can essentially send sort of distributed gradient updates to your model using differential privacy to protect the individual pieces of data in all of those respective silos, and try and learn some sort of joint model. Now, I think this is a beautiful technical idea, but it does not solve the organizational and administrative challenges around getting a whole bunch of hospitals to coordinate with each other, which I do not have a good answer to. I think this is something which is sort of ultimately going to come down to the hospital systems, the NHS, and to society. But I do think it's extremely important in all of this for people to understand what their data is being used for, so that they are capable of consenting to its use in whatever the downstream application may be. Yeah, so that's one possible technical solution. But yeah, if anyone knows how to get hospitals to work together, I'm very interested.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think the best way is to have partner, the research industry, hospitals, they have to partner together. And yeah, once we get over the obstacle of anonymation and encryption of data, and patients being also aware of where the data is going and why they are putting me so many sensors for what. Because sometimes you have the patients, in my PhD, I struggle finding patients to wear a step count for coronary artery disease. And I know that it's difficult to recruit patients because they don't want, some people, they don't just want their data to be used. I mean, number of steps per day wasn't really a big challenge. But I think, yeah, we need, once we get over the anonymation encryption obstacle, which is massive right now, I think we need to partner really together, industry, and help each other, industry, researchers, hospitals, and help each other to do the next step.
I think there's a lot of distrust within hospitals, between hospitals, between hospitals and the NHS, and with patients as to what's actually going to happen to their data. We've all heard the stories on the news of somebody's left a laptop on a train or whatever, whether it be somebody from the Department of Health or somebody's GP or whatever, and you all worry where your data is going to go. We need, as you said, with the partnerships, we need that, but we need that trust within the partners that that's where it stays, or that the data is only going to be used for that purpose. And we're not there yet. I've dealt with hospitals that were attacked by virus malwares and things years ago, and still don't want anybody else to plug into their Ethernet cables. So, you know, it's really scary. That's how some of these IT departments are still working. What's a firewall? You know, it's a worry. So yeah, we've got to get past that distrust.
Makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, in some sense, then the next question I was going to ask leads on directly about who do you think it is that's going to get people to realize the benefits of bringing, who's going to stimulate demand for this? Is it industry? Is it academia? Is it clinicians themselves? Or is it patients? Or is it the government? I mean, where is it that we should actually be? I mean, how do we get people to realize that the benefits are really out there in some cases already, that they really can, use these cutting edge tools which will actually make a difference? And therefore the risk trade-off of, we're going to take some risks and bring our data together, or take some risks and use this in a clinical setting. How are we going to convince people to do that? Who? And I don't think it's probably just one, but whose responsibility do you think now, Martin?
I think it has to start with probably the government that sort of starts the initiative, but also the society as well. So as we said before, people do not understand often what's AI, what's behind AI, because we don't all have the same background, thanks God. But you need to train, the young generation to understand what's behind there. And then, like we said before, having that mind shift to trusting more. And then the government should provide, first of all, guidance, because as industries are not able, they don't know what to do with AI because there are no regulations, no certification, no validation. It's really difficult. So there is the industries don't know what to do. And research is going fast as a train, but the world is sort of staying a little bit behind still. And I think the government has the power to bring that together, but also investing on the education of the young generation. I think that would be the combination of the two aspects that we really need to focus to if we want more AI in the real life.
Sharon.
Well, we have organisations like NHS Digital,
Yeah.
And they could probably be a little bit more vocal or obvious within a patient situation. I know clinicians would probably like to hear more from them as well as to what they think about how AI could be used more widely. Personally, I don't think a patient understands what actually happens to a biopsy once it's taken and how it gets to a diagnosis. And I'm convinced that a lot of patients have absolutely no idea whatsoever that it's a pathologist that makes that decision rather than non-oncologist or whatever. So I think educating the patients to a degree, yes, educate them as to what their data is used for, but they don't really need to understand, I don't think, that AI is being involved. They don't understand a tissue processor, so why should they understand AI? But yeah, be prepared that your data is going to be used. We will be running computer tests as well as physical tests. And I think that's probably sufficient. We don't want everybody scared that we've got some sort of iRobot situation going on. But yeah, I think governments, so the Department of Health and NHS Digital need to be more encouraging so that we do use these tools more.
Yeah, I think to echo some of the points that have already been made, I think as for the adoption of any new technology, it needs to be a combination of the right ecosystem existing to enable people to trust that this technology is going to be beneficial for them. So for example, if there is zero regulation around AI and your doctor says, oh, there's this new AI system, maybe you're not going to feel very comfortable about that. Whereas if you already know, yes, we can think of vaccines as a medical technology as an example where we trust vaccines because we know that there is a very rigorous process that they must go through before they're released. I think you can apply a similar logic to any kind of medical technology, including AI. So I think there needs to be that trust built up over the process of how this is created. And then I also think maybe on a more local level, you need success stories. You need exemplars to know, yes, AI was used and it did actually help and this is working, and trust can be built over time as you see, yes, it worked for this, it worked for this. So I think, potentially all it could take is, a few hospitals in the UK that have a particularly sort of forward thinking approach to it and are willing to run those pilot programs to demonstrate that, yes, you can do this. And then perhaps over time, people will see, yeah, there's been this system running at Addenbrooke's for however long and nothing bad has happened. I feel more comfortable to think about other use cases.
No, I think that's very simple. And I think we've seen some really great things during the conference here where I think people should be prepared to talk not just to their fellow peers, but to other people about how what this could potentially do both now and in the future. And really sort of, put pressure on people asking, well, I heard about these things that could happen. Why are they not happening with my data? That's how we get experimental drugs through. That's how we get vaccines through. People have a need for it. And the more we can do to get everybody understanding that it's a possibility and a plausible one at that is important. Thank you. So, moving on, we're I think all probably very glad that we're sitting here in person, actually enjoying the fact that we can actually interact together. But the role of digital healthcare and the role of thinking about how we do things digitally has changed remarkably over the last couple of years. A lot of it not by choice, and a lot of it forcing things that we thought were impossible to become possible very rapidly. I wondered what, if anything, you thought that we might have learned not just from, you know, the pandemic itself, but, you know, how we do things from the pandemic, what you think that might allow us to do, what kind of things in digital healthcare might be possible now that we've got the pandemic. And indeed, you know, if there are things that from a pandemic, we might have a pandemic in future, what we might learn in digital healthcare from that. Sharon.
I think it's definitely opened more people's ideas to the use of digital pathology. Pathologists can report from home, which obviously they weren't doing before. Nobody took glass slides home on the bus and decided they were going to get a microscope home. So the whole idea of digital pathology, I think, has been awoken in some people. And obviously with our education platform as well, we've shown you can still do the teaching remotely too. So we've got both ends of the spectrum there. I think we need people to be confident in those situations. We need people to be confident that data isn't being intercepted, that it's safe, however it's being transmitted. And I think we've shown throughout the pandemic that that's been the case. Not been any major leaks or anything that I'm aware of. So I think, yeah, we've seen an improvement. It's opened some doors, and it's made people realize that they do have more flexibility in where they can work. I think even within pathology, within the NHS, they've also discovered that the pathologist doesn't need to be in the hospital anymore. You can put them in a building in the car park if you want. They don't have to be in the corridors. So yeah, they can be anywhere. They don't need to be on site.
I think the pandemic forced a very rapid move to remote healthcare, which I think probably many people would say was coming down the pipe anyway, but this sort of rapidly accelerated the adoption of remote consultation and the like, which I think, yeah, this is obviously part of digital healthcare, and it's really important, especially for improving accessibility to healthcare for people who may not be able to travel, who live far away from their hospital or their doctor. So I think that's fantastic. I'm not sure everyone's had a universally positive experience with, you know, remote doctor's appointments, but I think it's laid the groundwork for potentially very novel ways of delivering healthcare, where maybe people don't have to always go to the hospital to get healthcare. They can do it remotely. And I think digital tools will only improve that experience. I think one of the other interesting things that I speculate the pandemic may have done is open people's eyes to a sort of pro-social data sharing. So I think, you know, very many people voluntarily opted into, you know, like contact tracing or, you know, reporting their health, and this idea that we work together, and by sharing data about myself, I can help other people and we can all work together. I think, you know, the COVID response was to some extent a reasonably successful example of people sort of coming together and realizing that their health data can help other people. So I think I'm optimistic that this has sort of made us as a society more aware of the fact that, you know, we can do this. As far as future pandemics, I think if I can give a sort of interesting, maybe negative learning from this, which we can take to the future, is I, along with probably very many other computer science researchers in 2020, jumped into action, tried to solve some sort of COVID-related problem. You know, we all really wanted to help. It was amazing to see how many papers were written about COVID that year. And I think, as I alluded to earlier, like there's a big translational gap. And I think a lot of these papers probably never made it into practice. And I think part of the challenge there was that, you know, you build some amazing, I don't know, COVID detector, and you have this awesome model, and then you try and bring it to a hospital and they have no infrastructure on which to deploy it. And I think perhaps this experience of trying to rush to the rescue and come up with different ideas has perhaps given us all a bit more experience, or forcing us to think a little bit more about making sure that the groundwork is there for you to build on top of. And I think COVID has probably forced, you know, for example, with this, you know, move to remote, forced a lot of new infrastructure to be built. And hopefully there will not be any future pandemics, but if there would be, perhaps we'll be in a better position to actually deploy some of the amazing digital solutions that we built, or that we would build.
Yeah, Yeah, I think we all got sort of shocked, I think, and socially shocked by the pandemic, and we might need some time to get back to normal again, I think. Definitely it helped to bring healthcare, to access healthcare even remotely for people that cannot travel, or there is maybe some places shortage of doctors, so that's also has been, online connection, internet, and all that stuff has been great during these years. Collaboration again is another thing that sort of, in the moment where we all struggled, we came together to do something useful for the society. So for example, I'm thinking here in Cambridge, we work together with universities and industries to build ventilators. MathWorks contributed in terms of the simulation side and the models, and then everyone else had their own bit, but we all collaborate together as a team, and to solve the problem of shortage of ventilators that we had at the beginning of the pandemic in the UK, and as well as developing ventilators that were usable in 2 patients at the same time. So controlling that in order that they were sort of safe. And I think that's really the learning, that we need to work together more, especially when we are in, a situation like that we have been. And in the future, again, hoping that we don't have another pandemic. I think the key message I think it's come through is that we need more. The simulation is where we need to go, because with that you can have, your data, you can have ventilators. In COVID case, you can simulate everything on the machine. It's much quicker. You can test all the scenarios, and you can just prototype in very short time and provide the solution in a very short time. So I think that's the learning I take from it. And yesterday I've heard about virtual patient as well. So that's another thing that is fascinating for me, that you can study what will be the response, what will be the therapy, what will be the diagnosis for a virtual patient, and then apply that on, everyone that needs. So I think, yeah, this simulation is going to be the solution for it. Hopefully not another pandemic.
Let's hope not. But I think collaboration, and as you mentioned, is something that's very important. And I think we'll come back to that in another question in a little while. But I think one of the things that we have to be, and we've already touched on it quite a lot, but we have to be very mindful of, is that there are quite a lot of risks around widespread use of AI in digital healthcare. And there's of course the obvious risks around data privacy and things, but there's probably other risks as well. Do we have enough people? Do we have enough? What do you think are the sort of biggest risks that we face deploying widespread use of AI in healthcare, and how can we mitigate them?
Yeah, one that I can think of is definitely misprediction or misdiagnosis, or the model might not be 100% accurate, especially if we don't have enough data and variety of data to take in account during the training. We know that it's very easy to have an AI sort of app in our smartphones, so can be misused as well by people that are not experts. So you might get, I don't know, something to diagnose something on your skin, for example. You take a picture and with your smartphone, and you get the wrong diagnosis. So I think you need to be very careful with that, because if you get a misprediction, then normal people might get very scared. So you get all the sort of psychological side of it, and it is not where we want to go, I think. Then there are all the classical things of GDPR and sort of privacy and stuff like that. So that's also already been said earlier, so I won't repeat. So I think, yeah, the misusing and misprediction that can happen has to be somehow controlled a little bit, and making people aware as well that until we have 100% accurate model, there is still that sort of, as a doctor might also do a wrong diagnosis. How many times happens? Yeah. So it can be a human fault or a machine fault. We just need to be very careful when we even like, I'm the first one that got scared when I look on internet. I look for some symptoms. Oh my God, I'm going to. But I need to sort of calm down and think, okay, that's not probably what I'm thinking.
Sharon, what do you?
I think one danger is over-reliance. What we don't want is somebody a clinician or a hospital department to over-rely on an algorithm. It needs that element of the human check. I think even if we have an algorithm that we are completely confident in, I would still like to think that that doctor checks, 1 in 5. Don't just take the algorithm's word for it. And then obviously we've got the responsibility side of that. So if an algorithm does make a false positive, where does that responsibility lie? Does that responsibility lie with the clinician? Should they have checked the algorithm? Does that responsibility lie with the manufacturer of the algorithm? Or even, I don't know, the scanner, if it's, where has the responsibility come from? So we don't want to over-rely on computers at all. We still need that human element.
So the thing that worries me about, like, specifically the types of statistical models we have in machine learning, these very high dimensional models, is that they may have behaviors that we didn't think about characterizing at the time we were developing them, which may become manifest when you actually deploy them. So there, I think there's this risk of these sort of insidious errors, and we've seen some discussion of this today already about spurious correlations that the model is picking up on, and it's resulting in incorrect predictions. But it could be incorrect predictions in such a way that you don't quite realize that, for example, its errors are not uniformly distributed across the population, and you end up having a model which, unbeknownst to the developers, could be, for example, systematically failing on certain types of people. That's something which I certainly do not like the idea of. And further to that, another related statistical concern would be distribution shift. So, we develop our models in an environment, usually using retrospectively collected data, typically where the model did not exist. And then we deploy it into a world where it now exists. And the people using it may change their behavior. It could be a case of over-reliance. They see, oh, models has patients fine. I'm not going to order the test I would otherwise have ordered, which would have indicated that they're not actually fine. And this is something which, there are technical solutions and ideas on how we work around this, but I think a lot of it is actually a question of understanding how the combined model human system is going to work. How will doctors actually use these systems? But I also think this is part of the mitigation. So this idea of always having the human in the loop, ideally, the model is not going to be replacing a person making a diagnosis. It's going to be assisting them. And that person will hopefully be able to realize, model's behaving a little bit strangely here, or model's very confidently wrong. And so having a person there working alongside it, being able to interpret the results and integrate it along with all of the other evidence that they're using to make their decisions, it's just another data point. I think that can be a huge mitigating factor. Another more technical solution is, having models that actually output uncertainties. So, it sort of tries to quantify when it doesn't know something so that for sure we need to consult a person here. These can help. Regarding the insidious errors after deployment, I think I'm also really excited about the idea of, we do post-market surveillance of pharmaceuticals. You could easily do sort of post-deployment surveillance of machine learning systems, have a whole suite of different metrics you're continuously checking. If there is a distribution shift, like for whatever reason, suddenly the people coming to your hospital are a lot younger than they used to be, and this starts changing how your model is behaving, you'll see it as quickly as possible and be able to step in and do something about it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think we might have Johnny with us. Is that right? Okay, we are just going to get him up on screen. Is that the plan?
I am here.
Johnny, can you hear us?
I can hear you, yes.
Excellent, welcome. Johnny Hancock is from Nvidia, and we, as we said earlier, the Nvidia has had a huge impact on the use of graphics cards for computing, particularly in the AI machine learning space. And so we're delighted that you can join us. We've had a few questions already, but I'll ask you to give your opening statement, if that's okay, which is what is the biggest implication of AI for medical imaging and healthcare for Nvidia?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing I should say is obviously I can't really speak on behalf of Nvidia because I'm one very small cog in a very large and complicated machine. And it's, also, of course, I belong to a particular department that probably has its own sort of view in relation to healthcare. Nevertheless, well, it's interesting because just in the time I've been in Nvidia, I would say that things have changed quite a lot. There's never been any doubt, of course, that AI and computation have got a role to play in the within sort of AI and healthcare. But I think the nature of that and where the most sort of pressing and interesting problems lie has probably evolved somewhat. For example, who would have predicted a few years ago that AlphaFold would have generated the results it has? And I think that has directed perhaps a lot of attention towards what was previously quite a sort of niche application. But now with the these fantastic results, and of course the subsequent publication of all these protein structures, it's generated a whole new interest in like I say, what was previously quite a specialized sort of area. But I think it's a very important area because, of course, for healthcare, drugs are obviously a very key part of what's in our armory to deal with various conditions. So I think from NVIDIA's point of view, that this whole sort of computational chemistry, computational biology is a kind of new problem that is generating a lot of internal interest. Now, of course, that's not to say that AI still doesn't have a role to play in the more traditional areas of radiology and computational pathology and various other kind of imaging-based challenges. But of course, the other one is this whole sort of natural language area as well. That obviously there are lots of healthcare applications for natural language, but of course the transform-based models as well are having quite an effect much wider than just natural language. And again, in this whole computational chemistry space, with things like the the SMILES ASCII formulation of chemical structures, you can use these same techniques to discover drugs with desired properties. So I find it really interesting that the pace of change in this area and how the techniques are evolving and changing, and what seemed impossible a few years ago is suddenly now becoming tractable. So I just think we're finding more and more use cases, and I think it's a really fascinating time to be in this space.
Brilliant, thank you. So I mean, my next question actually follows on very nicely from that. So I mean, we've got a number of young academics in the audience who are really excited about thinking about what their next projects should be. What do you think are the most interesting technical challenges? Not necessarily in mathematics. You're very welcome to step up and write it on the board if you want, but no compulsion. But sort of what do you think are the most important technical challenges that you wish people were thinking about solving, and thinking about the people we might have here? So I mean, Stephanie, do you want to start with that, and then we'll go around?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to be completely biased here and cite the area that I work in, which obviously I think is very important and exciting, and perhaps an interesting position to have at a medical imaging conference. I think multimodal applications are really, really important, and like a sort of up and coming area. So thinking, we know health is not a unimodal process. It's not just about imaging. As Johnny mentioned, there's also text, there's natural language processing, we have time series, we have various different types of, we have genomics, immunomics, lots of different types of data, different views of the patient. And I think thinking about, machine learning systems that are able to integrate the different information from these different modalities to, create a holistic view of the patient, I think is really important, both because we know most of the medical diagnostic questions you might answer are probably going to require multiple pieces of information, but also because this is something which is going to really assist people, because you're, as a single clinician or healthcare provider, there's only so many pieces of data you can have in your head at any one moment. And if you're trying to perhaps diagnose a very complex patient, it could be something that was mentioned in one of their notes 5 years ago that actually helps you figure out what the diagnosis is. And for you to be able to remember that is really challenging. But if you had a system, for example, that says, given the imaging data we have right now, the pathology, perhaps this thing from their past history is actually really relevant, or given their past history, this piece of imaging is really important. Not only like being able to integrate that, but also simply just surfacing it to the clinician, I think could be really, really powerful. So yeah, not just imaging, but other modalities, I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think the way would be that the future will be personalized medicine, therapy, diagnosis. So everything, it's very difficult to keep in mind all the information about a patient. So having that tools that help you to consider all the aspects are really useful. And I think another nice thing would be to, once we have established the workflow, the clinical workflow, which again will take a little bit of regulation, validation, all that steps that we need to do. I think it would be excellent to have, once we have a new patient, use those new data to retrain your model. Consider that as a continuous online training of the model, because that will improve the accuracy and take in account all the diversity of the demographic, the different countries. But it needs a lot of work in terms of standardize the data, making sure that everyone does acquires the data in a certain way, and for that you need time and rules.
I think the idea of getting everything to work together is fantastic, and I think it's got to be the way forward. There are too many times when a patient is prescribed a drug that is probably interacting with something they've been taking for years. And if it's a new GP or whoever, they go to a hospital appointment, for example, they might not know that they've been put on a particular drug and they've been taking it for years. And that could be the thing that kills them. So we do need to make sure that in the way that we trace a patient, the way that we're tracking a patient throughout their lives, through the healthcare services, that they all talk to each other. So the hospitals talk to the GPs talk to the pharmacists, so they know just what these patients are taking and what their results have been from the various tests and how that might affect what their next course of action is. And maybe even as a predictor of what they might come across in the future. So maybe a bit of patient family history in there as well, just as an indicator as to what to consider for future.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Johnny.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things which really sort of piqued my interest recently. I think one is this move away from the sort of exhaustive, sort of deterministic and computationally expensive sort of physics-based models towards these more machine-learned, approximations, and they allow for much more powerful sort of models, which can be used for all sorts of things. So one great example is computational fluid dynamics. Now, that's a really expensive, thing to simulate. And the upshot of these techniques and their applications is that, you can model things to do with sort of human biology and biochemistry at many different scales. And if some of them are just intractable because the sort of complexities involved, but using these kind of approaches and some of the sort of visualization as well that you can do with, sort of 3D graphics as well to help people understand what's going on. I think that's a really interesting area. It kind of builds on that theme I mentioned before, the sort of, computational kind of chemistry stuff. If you imagine, making a model of a single cell and all the complexity. I know people have done this, but I can see these sorts of models being a really sort of fruitful research area. I completely echo the thought of the sort of multimodal as well. I think this is just, when a clinician makes any sort of prediction or diagnosis or whatever it might be, they don't just look at radiology or electronic healthcare record. They look at the patient, the physical patient. They look at all that history, and I think still got a way to go for this sort of breaking down the silos of AI. There's definitely a lot of interesting things to come from that. One final thing as well, I think this sort of I think it's a very interesting area. It's not really necessarily an AI one. It's a kind of combination of things. This sort of, what is the most efficient human and sort of computer interaction? We're seeing things like, for example, with one of the projects that we're involved with called Monai Label, which really removes this or sort of bypasses the need to do this sort of distinct model training and then model inference, because it's an interactive process. It doesn't involve any coding. If you want to learn to segment, the heart or something, you just get shown images, and you segment it, and each time you segment it, the model improves, with your interactions. What's the most efficient way of leveraging people's expertise, but letting the sort of computer do the hard work? I think that's a really interesting kind of area.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that leads me very nicely onto I think my last question before we open it up to other people. What do you think, or how should academia and industry collaborate most effectively in AI for healthcare? And given the audience, are there one or two things that you would say please do or please don't do as academics when collaborating with industry? Sharon.
Oh, I think the first word is openly. So collaborate openly and freely, and by all means approach us as industry. Anybody, we take on all sorts of people all over the world. I know our head office is in Finland, but I'm not. We've got offices in the States as well. So if anybody wants to join us, you're more than welcome. But yeah, we want to see that we can work alongside academia as much as possible and help where possible. So if you think there's something that we're already doing that you might want to know how we do, there are certain ways we might be able to help you with that. We're obviously not going to give away all the secrets. But yeah, I would say openly.
Yeah, I think echoing that, obviously all collaborations should be open, but they should also be mutually beneficial. I think especially in machine learning, there are certain things that are easier to do in industry and certain things that are easier to do in academia. And I think having relationships where you're able to mutually benefit from it, perhaps make use of compute from industry. But then, for example, like at Microsoft, we're very keen on making sure that data remains the sort of property of those who already control it. And so, for example, we work with this idea of a trusted research environment. So figuring out ways for us to be able to bring our expertise, for example, to an academic like hospital, to be able to bring our experience in machine learning, large scale machine learning, but then also to do it in a way where we don't need to ever really touch the data and that they can maintain ownership of the data. I think figuring out these perhaps more logistical challenges is really important. And it's really important, both obviously from a patient privacy perspective, but also so that both parties involved can come to it understanding, we are here to help each other. This isn't an exploitative relationship in any way. This is something where we are working in an ecosystem to try and, improve research for human health. I think that's quite important. And of course, if you're interested in working with Microsoft, we have internships. Come talk to us later. We have stickers. No, I mean, we do have stickers.
Brilliant, thank you. Johnny.
Yeah, I think we have enjoy a very good relationship with academia generally. I think particularly the medical kind of academic hospitals that we work closely with all around the world. Most of my team are former academics themselves. So, and I think the one of the most fruitful sort of forums from which we're able to collaborate is with open source initiatives, such as something like our medical open network for AI or MONAI. We have that was quite literally started with a sort of a collaboration between academia and not just Nvidia, but actually other industrial partners as well. That's a really nice way of sort of working very kind of closely and fruitfully with academia. I also really like that we get very close involved with conferences such as this one, and MICI sort of type conferences too for medical imaging, and they're always really great way to sort of people to come together and share ideas as well. I think supporting those conferences is a really valuable thing that Nvidia quite often does. So internships, again, as was mentioned, that's I'd say the majority of probably the internships end up some sort of offer. Ultimately, they're a really great way of finding very skilled people who are keen to work for your in industry as well.
Thank you.
I mean, I think about in a couple how they're going to continue living together, talk to each other, right? So if they don't know each other, they are going to divorce. So knowing what each other needs is the only way to collaborate. So collaboration, talking, understanding what you do, understanding what industry does, is the only way to go forward. So I think, yeah, we need to, and as Microsoft, we also have many offices worldwide. We have internships, blah, blah, blah. So we really collaborate a lot with academia. I'm actually in the academia team, so I work with universities, helping researchers using MATLAB and Simulink. So we do already that, and we have some projects going on. Sorry, but I think, yeah, think about the couple style, and I think we also need a third element, government as well, because otherwise we don't go anywhere. So it has to be a couple of three.
Thank you. So I'd now like to open it up to questions from anyone in the audience. I have a question. Jude, can we use the mic so that? Thank you.
So one of the interesting things about AI-assisted pathology, as you say, that pathologists can then use that as a support. And if we think about various terrible accidents in the airline industry, when experienced pilots have become so used to relying on the computational systems that get everything right all the time, how do we protect against that within pathology? Against the idea that pathologists get so used to the AI always giving the correct diagnosis that they become less aware and less precise and less understanding of when things aren't right.
So, I mean, I might broaden it out to in general, but
yeah,
pathology.
I think for a pathologist in their daily work, I think there would need to be some sort of procedure of personal check-in and maybe peer check-in. They do that anyway when they're looking at slides down a microscope. So I don't see why it shouldn't be the case when they're doing digital pathology or if they're using an AI digitally. So there is an element of a peer review or personal review. And I don't think we're at a point yet where we've got pathologists who are that confident in an AI that they would be happy to just press play and leave it, sort of thing, there's still an element of double checking, even though we're saying, yes, you can base your diagnosis on this answer, there is still going to be an element of checking. But I think in time they need to put in place some sort of review process. Check 1 in 5 or whatever.
Others of you, Johnny, would you like to?
Yeah, great question. I think there's a few sort of way. I mean, the first point to make is, as was really just alluded to, I mean, that is highly unlikely to happen today because there are very few algorithms that have, first reader sort of, primary, reader status. Most of them are just providing, ancillary information upon which, a clinician may make some diagnosis or not. But, in anticipation of when that time does come, I think the first thing is, taking a lesson from the airline industry. It's all about, fail safe. So don't just rely on one algorithm, rely on, an ensemble of algorithms. And, if they're all in concordance, then the chances are that, what they're predicting is more likely to be correct. Particularly obviously algorithms that use diverse methods as well. I think the other thing is, there's a lot of talk about sort of explainability as well. I think, it's not always straightforward and easy to produce explainable results because, with this highly dimensional data, it's often not easy to do that. But nevertheless, there are certain things you can do as well, like, showing, the particular features that are of concern in the machine's diagnosis. And again, also really importantly, a level of uncertainty in the prediction as well. That's often not, you often don't see that. But I think those things in combination, along with other kind of sensible safety checks, like having other people review it makes a lot of sense.
Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo a lot of the points already said. I think I would also say, I think if we get to a point where the users are sort of completely trusting and relaxing of the system, we've done a really great job because obviously it's working very well. So in a way, that would be ideal, right? You sort of want technology to be invisible. You want it to just work and you don't have to think about it. But yeah, I think as Sharon said, you would want some kind of review system. Like it is already, speaking about radiology, for example, there is already a need to do, there is an expectation that they will do peer review. So, occasionally, reports will be re-reported or studies will be re-reported. But it's basically practically not possible right now because the reporting workload is so high. So if you were able to get to a position where, a large number of these could be, yeah, okay, this is fine. And then you just sample some for additional checks. This would be a wonderful position to be in. But yeah, of course, we don't want to become complacent. And like the points I was saying before about, these insidious errors, about maybe it's making mistakes in very obscure ways. I think we can also have additional computational checks to see, are there any errors that are not getting picked up by the humans as well during, for example, these peer review checks.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that has been said already, and probably the checks should be done in, depending on the diagnosis that we're looking at, focusing more checks and peer reviews on sort of checking more, trying different algorithms in the false positives, false negatives, depending on what we are looking at. So having a little bit of open eye on those cases that can be misleading. But yeah, I mean, what the other panelists have said, yeah, totally agree.
Brilliant. Thank you. Other questions?
Maybe less a question, but more like a comment about the academia industry collaboration. I think there has been some challenges raised by you at the very early on the lack of access to the data, public trust about deploying the AI, public distrust or trust about using or reusing the data. And I think this is very good opportunity for the industry and academia actually to try jointly show that the data are not basically harvested by some companies, but actually they do. I mean, I'm saying about harvesting the data, which most likely what's gonna reported on the newspapers headlines is basically all of those bad cases rather than those positive cases, which also was mentioned by one of you, right? So I think maybe also you can share some thoughts about that. Building this trust, public trust, and public not on the data sharing, but also on AI deployment in the future by the joint collaboration between the industry and academia. Thank you.
Thank you. Johnny, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think just one brief point. I kind of agree with the point that was made, and I think it is a little bit sort of sad, really, that we find ourselves in a situation. I'm sure we're not alone in this. That we do our best to not ever touch any sort of healthcare data directly, and it's really just because of this fear of the sort of PR disaster. And there have been a few of those in the past, and we have to be extremely cautious, and you just wonder, and I can completely understand why it's a necessary thing for a company to do that. But of course, you just wonder what progress is being sort of somewhat hampered by this very defensive necessary step to not avoid these PR disasters, because there are lots of journalists out there just waiting to jump on sort of any errors that are made in judgment in this space.
I was just going to say on the back of what Johnny's just said there, the media and the press don't want to report a good news story. They always want the negatives or the bad ones or the failures or the ones that have all gone wrong. They don't want the good news. So I suppose we as industry need to make sure that we are promoting the positives more, maybe making a bigger noise about things when they happen.
Yeah. In a way, at MathWorks, we do that. We have a website with all the sort of collaborations that we had with industries, universities, and we just let them tell everybody how they success in their project, in their product. So we try to do that on our sort of little, it's not BBC, of course, or any other important broadcast, but we try to do that and to mention those every time we talk to, we did this with these guys at University of X. They published, they got funding, all this kind of stuff. So it does change the mind, the psychology of people when they see that. It really helps. Yeah.
Yeah, I would basically agree with the commentary. I think it's, having these, relationships with academia, I think it helps to communicate to people that, industrial research is also research. It's still research. It's not, harvesting data and then so on. But I also think, the public it's reasonable for them to be concerned about how their data is being used, because we're sort of in this new era where there is a lot of data about us, and it's, variously available, and we're still, there's GDPR and so on, but it's still an evolving regulatory universe. Like there's still ongoing litigation about how data can be used and for what purpose, and how can AI be used, and all of these things. So I think I'm glad that people are concerned about their data use, because I think this is going to eventually coalesce into some hopefully really good protections for people's data, patient data, but that we can also figure out ways that it can enable the digital innovation that we, as researchers in this field presumably believe is very much possible if we can use that data. But I really, as a person and a patient, I don't want my data to be misused either. So I think it's really good that we are having this level of scrutiny and these discussions about how it's used, so that we can end up with something that is, respectful of people's data while also enabling good research.
Thank you. So I know that the time of the session sort of come to an end, but given we started a bit late, I'm gonna ask everybody for one final set of comments. So I'm gonna ask you all, what do you think we should all look out for in the next, the next big trend in automated medical systems, say over the next decade? What are you most excited about that's coming forward that you think everybody here should be excited about too? And I'll start with Martine.
I think virtual patient is my heart. I did a little bit. I'm biased because my PhD was a little bit about that, but yeah, personalized medicine and virtual patient is what I think is the future, and we need to be prepared to sort of be able to read different type of data, collect different type of data, being able to process them, have the models to predict them, as well as have the doctors on board so they can rely on that. And we need a lot of as well computational power, because that is going to be gigantic. So we need to be prepared with sort of resources that can process that amount of data for the benefit of, for the society in general. So I think my bet is on virtual patient, but let's talk in 100 years.
Johnny, should we go for you next?
Yeah, I think the term personalized medicine's been around for a long time, but I would say it's far from really being realized yet. And I think a lot of the themes that we've talked about today are really only starting to come together to make that sort of practical clinical value. But I'm very excited by that prospect, and it sort of brings together a whole load of different domains, including genomics and computational chemistry and radiology and pathology, natural language processing. I think when all those things come together, the sort of predictive power that unleashes is really exciting. So there's a lot of work to be done, of course, to make that sort of deployment and sort of robust and safe for clinical use. But really look forward to working on that.
Great, thank you. Definitely.
Yeah, so I think a 10-year horizon is interesting. I think in the machine learning world, 10 years is enough for multiple revolutions to have occurred. It's a very fast-moving field, so I dare not speculate on what sorts of models we might be playing with in 10 years. I think there's some trends in there, like really large language models, for example, which are very exciting. There's sort of this sense of scaling and like qualitatively new behaviors emerging is really exciting. But if I'm to think about a 10-year horizon in healthcare, I once had a collaborator in the NHS suggest to me that it's going to take 10 years to implement anything. So if I think about what is, if I think about what's promising right now, which might be in all of our lives in a healthcare way in 10 years, I'm not just saying this to pander to the crowd. I think imaging is where it's going to be at. I really think that 10 years from now, it will basically be ubiquitous, that imaging workflows will involve AI in some way, and that it will ideally be, very user-friendly, almost transparent, just supporting, radiologists, the people I think about, but, various imaging workflows and be supported by AI, and it will just be accepted, and it will be beneficial. It may even be available to patients. For example, I could imagine a system where I get a chest X-ray and then I can use a system to help me interpret it, to understand what it is. And that's just accepted. Like we all, you can go into Google Translate and just translate text, and that's accepted that you can do this. Why can't we also understand our medical records similarly? So I think, being maybe a little bit more realistic in my expectation or my hopes, I think, even just getting the tech that we can see, in the machine learning we're building right now, getting that actually into people's lives and into their healthcare, that's my 10-year prediction.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to say, having been working in healthcare for probably longer than some of these people here who have been alive, I think you're very realistic in your assumption that what we're doing now may be fully embraced within the next 10 years. 5 years ago, putting digital pathology in front of a pathologist was like, putting somebody's worst scary thing in front of them. It was just, you didn't want to do it because it was just going to be declined or turned away. But I think things like companion diagnostics that I've worked with in the past as well, I think they're going to start involving AI more. So where a drug company is perhaps developing a drug for a particular area, they develop an analytical test for that. And then also we're going to develop an AI to go alongside the analytical test. So I think we're going to have to get all the various areas working together. And I think the idea that Johnny said about getting radiology and pathology and everybody else maybe to work from the same computer system within a hospital would be
That would be nice within 10 years.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, I'm sure we all want to thank the panel for what has been a really, really interesting discussion. So Sharon, Martina, Stephanie, Johnny, and your companies as well for supporting both the conference and the session as well. So Hyforia, MathWorks, Microsoft, and Nvidia. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Please do.
Please.
Which one are we looking at? One eyeball on each.